Good morning, everybody. I'm Tim O'Brien, the Senior Executive Editor of Bloomberg Opinion. This is our Tuesday morning politics live stream. I'm joined today by the great Matt Iglesias. Matt brings a lot of incredible bona fides to the table. He's a political economy columnist, I would call him, and a political columnist. He's an observer of power and money and society and equity. I could go on because he covers the landscape and he does it very well. And I asked him to come in today because we're trying to check in on the DNC this week and think about some of the energy that's on display there, what it means out in the real world of trench warfare and electoral politics, particularly in the swing states. So we've got a lot to chew off. And I want to remind all of you that you can ask Matt and myself some questions during this, and we will try to get to those. Anyway, good morning, Matt.
Good morning.
So you were watching last night. I'm here in Chicago at the DNC. I was in the United Center for all of the evening's kind of marquee speeches, including the Obamas. The Obamas came out. They lit the place up, both of them. They both gave very strong speeches. And, I imagine they would have come out to the same thunderous applause if Joe Biden was still in the race. But I do think everyone recognizes there's been this epic sea change since in the just avalanche of crazy political developments over the last couple months. Since he stepped out of the race and Kamala Harris has come into the race, there is that ineffable buzz of enthusiasm and engagement that's really ramped up, and that was clearly here last night. But do you have any kind of broad stroke impressions from the first couple days of this convention?
Well, I mean, one thing that you're seeing is that the Democratic Party has, I would say, a deeper and broader bench of talent than Republicans have. That, you've seen the sort of callbacks to the Obamas, to Hillary Clinton the previous night. You have the incumbent president of the United States, who's not even close to the most anticipated speaker. The roll call that sort of started things off Tuesday, where each state had a kind of a signature, pop or rock song. And, Republicans keep having trouble with like artists saying, please don't play my music at your rally. Democrats had Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez speak on Monday. They had Bernie Sanders speak on Tuesday. There's a lot of people, governors of Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. These are key states. They're all Democrats. So that's the kind of underlying fundamental strength that has been there this whole time, but with a new nominee who is a little more charismatic, a little more dynamic, capable of racing from Chicago to Milwaukee to do a parallel rally. It's sort of coming to the fore, right? Instead of people feeling, Barack Obama is going to speak and it's going to overshadow our nominee, it's complementary, right? You have a lot of strong speakers. You have a lot of enthusiasm. And you have, a modest lead in the polls. That's just sort of the thing to keep in mind is that, there's a transformation of energy, enthusiasm, dynamism, a campaign that I think Democrats feel very proud of, a candidate that they're happy to stand behind. But it's still an incredibly close election. If you see the kind of polling errors that we had in 2016 or 2020, that means Trump's going to win, right? There's a lot of people who like him out in the country, and there is a lot of, discontent still with the direction that things have been under over the past few years.
Well, and I think both of the Obamas last night went out of their way amid all of the huzzas and writing this tsunami of enthusiasm to say we have a tough battle ahead as Democrats, particularly as we all know in the swing states. I think there's been a turnaround in the swing states. I think Biden, was several points down in key states. The ones that popped for me, I think, before he stepped out, Nevada and Michigan, I think were the ones where I think, it was like 9 points possibly in Nevada and 13 in Michigan, or vice versa. But it was stuff that went well beyond the idea of polling margins of error and
absolutely
and seemed bleak. And I think, you now, I think, have an evening of the table, but not a sure thing by any means. And I think that's why both Michelle Obama and Barack Obama were saying to people, don't just live with your joy, get out there, vote, organize people, do what you have to do. Um, I want to get into all of these dynamics this morning,
Yeah.
but you saw Obama at his sort of coming out speech in 2004, and then his nomination speech in 2008. You have a bit of the sense of an arc. I thought, by the way, I thought Michelle Obama's speech last night, I was more impressed by hers than his,
Hmm.
and his was wildly impressive. But, what do you see in the sort of arc of the Obama's presence and the arc in his arc as a speech maker?
He has this theme that has gone through, I think, all of the convention speeches he's done. I remember in 2004, I was in the hall, and it was called the Fleet Center at the time. I think it's TD Bank Garden now. And a friend of mine who worked in Illinois politics told me, it's like, you got to see Barack Obama's speech. You got to like get out of line, stop buying pretzels. And it was fascinating actually to hear at the time a speech that so much centered the notion of trying to depolarize the country. And that's a theme that he has stuck with. Michelle Obama in her speech emphasized the need of the people in her audience to go do the mechanical work of campaigning, right? To do something. Don't be nervous, don't doom scroll, don't just clap, but like, donate, volunteer, knock on doors, things like that. uh, Barack,
She's the realist and he's the poet.
yes,
Uh,
but Barack really tried to move to the middle ground conceptually to say that Democrats should acknowledge the discomfort that a lot of people, particularly older people in the United States, have with he didn't use the word cancel culture, but that's what he was talking about, with linguistic change, with a sense of kind of intolerance of deviationism. And it's not as good an applause line as anything in Michelle Obama's speeches, but there's like real practical advice in there that I hope Democrats take to heart. I think some people think that Obama's charisma is like unrelated to the content of what he says or how he governed, but he always tried to go the extra mile to demonstrate that he was the reasonable voice in the room, to acknowledge complexity. And this was part of his charisma. His rhetorical facility is being able to incorporate some more complicated ideas, a more complicated portrait of America than you typically sort of hear in politics. And that's part of the job, right? When you think about swing voters, whether it's in Michigan or Wisconsin or Nevada or Arizona, Georgia, you're talking by definition about people who don't see the choice between the parties as obvious, people who have some doubts about both coalitions. And
and who
he's
need to and
trying,
who need to be persuaded.
yeah, and who need to have their various concerns validated, that America will be in safe hands with Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. And he in a unique way, I think, tried to make that pitch, not as just an attack on Trump or just a repetition of the biggest applause lines in the room, but to try to actually speak to at least his impression of what it is undecided voters might want to hear from Democrats. And that's a good exercise. I mean, I know all kinds of people in Washington who are my age or younger who have parents who are, and uncles and aunts who are older than them, who live in the Midwest. And people know how to talk to other human beings, right? This is actually an experience that we've all had. But, can you engage in politics, which acknowledges what people are like and meets them where they are, is something that's challenging.
I think that's one of the strengths Walls brings to
Hmm.
the ticket. He's like the guy standing there with with the hot dog on a fork at a barbecue in the backyard and wants to talk about sports, politics, and local businesses. Um, this is an interesting segue into Harris, thinking about Obama and where he lives intellectually and politically. Harris and Obama are both trained lawyers.
Mhm.
But Obama, to a certain extent, really lived in the life of the law itself. Harris was a prosecutor, and I think Michelle Obama brings that realpolitik view
Mhm.
that I think separates her to a certain extent from Barack Obama, because I think he's had this kumbaya
Mhm.
approach with its virtues to American politics. But at times I worried or wondered if he wasn't aware of how quickly Republicans wanted to just tear his face off.
Yeah, and
And
she's the real warrior, and she
yes,
talked about that, facing those attacks, and she had her famous "When they go low, we go high" line from years ago, and frankly had a different message last night, about the need to fight back.
yeah, I think it's the Trump factor and how he has tempered and shaped everyone's views of the era we're in. Let's cut to a quick clip of Kamala Harris in Wisconsin last night and use that as a departure point to talk about where her campaign is right now.
Just yesterday, when he was asked if he has any regrets about ending Roe v. Wade, Donald Trump, without even a moment's hesitation, you would think he would reflect on it for a second, said no regrets. Bad behavior should result in a consequence. Well, we will make sure he does face a consequence, and that'll be at the ballot box in November.
So, you have two things going on there. Harris is obviously hitting on one of the most salient and powerful policy points that Democrats can leverage in this election season, which is abortion. And it's become a huge rallying issue, as it always has, but it's, I think, even more intense now, particularly for women voters, although you have, male surrogates now out there embracing this too as a talking point. And then also, actions have consequences, and that's Kamala Harris, the former California State Attorney General, and the law and order candidate who believes people should live by the rules. When you see that clip or think about her right now, what do you think are some of the strengths and the weaknesses of the Harris campaign at this point, Matt?
Well, so you see two things, right? One is you have the audience with the freedom signs, right? And so this is a way that Democrats have been talking about the abortion rights issue in a frame that connects to a very resonant American value, and then leaning into the biography as a prosecutor. There was a very powerful introductory video that aired last night all about her work, and this is authentic. I mean, she developed a bad reputation in national politics based on the primary campaign that she ran in 2019, 2020. And that's because it was a very genuinely, the thing that she has done in her career is been a prosecutor. She was a line prosecutor in Oakland and then again in San Francisco. She ran for district attorney. She did that job. She ran for attorney general. She did that job. She was only in the Senate very briefly. The set of issues that she's most comfortable talking with involve prosecuting. It's the bulk of her biography, and they are now comfortable, I think correctly, articulating that this is a Democrat who believes in compassion and concern for people who are sick, people who are poor, people who need help from the government. But she's somebody who believes in rules, and that Trump's rule breaking is something she wants to see punished. But it's not unique. They've talked a lot about this border security bill. They've talked a lot about the falling homicide rate over the past couple of years. They've talked about her work over the years prosecuting a wide range of criminals and sort of bad actors. And that's a classic Democratic Party message, but different from ones that we heard in 2020 or 2016 cycles. But it fits her well. And the enthusiasm, that you see in the crowds, right? Part of the energy of having a candidate who the base likes is that the candidate can then articulate a message that is geared outside the base, because you're not constantly sort of tending the fires back at home. I think a problem Biden got into is that, because people liked him, but they didn't love him. So he was always kind of watching his left flank, whereas she is kind of more out there, particularly when talking about the border, talking about crime, which have been her sort of two big vulnerabilities. I do think the economy just continues to be a struggle for her. Trump has an edge there. People have not liked the experience of the past couple of years, and Democrats just disagree amongst themselves as to what they should say about that.
Well, I think the Democrats make the mistake of talking about inflation when they should talk about affordability. And maybe I'm splitting hairs there, but I do think it resonates differently because the data shows that inflation is tempering dramatically, which it has, amid an economy with robust GDP growth, robust jobs growth, robust wage growth, and then this bugaboo of inflation. But I think the real issue is this decades-long fracturing of the American dream for working Americans and lower income Americans who see all of these things slipping beyond their grasp under this umbrella of affordability, whether it's college for their kids or their own retirement or a home. And then you get this added jolt of inflation and grocery prices and gas prices. And I think the Democrats really have to think about how they wed the notion of opportunity to affordability to the economy and embrace, the places where businesses do improve people's lives and are game changers for people's lives. And that's always, that's sat oddly within the Democratic Party.
No, I think that's right. And you saw Barack Obama talked about housing in his speech, a kind of unusual level of policy detail, talking about, bureaucratic rules and red tape that prevent new construction. And I do think something that, weighs on Democrats broadly is that people know that the cost of living in New York and California is much higher than it is in a lot of sort of conservative type states. And they also know that, you can't transport the weather and scenery of California to Wisconsin. Right. And so they want to know, it's like, what are you going to do to sustain economic opportunity in these kinds of states in a way that I think includes the kind of social welfare programs that Democrats like to talk about, but that goes beyond them, right? I mean, people want to earn a living for themselves if they can. And, they want the government to help people who need help. But I think Harris at her best has been talking about the kind of aspirational arc that relates to her parents' immigrant experience. And that is something that, is very fundamental to American character, that this is supposed to be a country of opportunity for people.
And that people should have a sense of dignity about their own lives, that everyone is entitled to feel dignified and embrace dignity in the way they live each day. And in a society in which your dignity gets arbitrarily undermined, there is a problem. And I think that's what informs a lot of the resentment and anger that's permeated our politics. On that note, let's take a look at the Trump campaign and where they are right now. I want to go to a little clip of Trump on the campaign trail.
They do polls and this stuff, and I'm at like 93%. I said, so why are we having an election? They didn't have an election. Why are we having an election? I am much better looking than her. I think I'm much better. Much better. I'm a better looking person than Kamala.
Well, decoding Trump is always a trip. When I see that clip, so there's two things going on there too. The first is the candidate who stoked an insurrection on January 6, 2021 is suddenly very observant of the minutia of democratic processes. to me, that's, it is emblematic of, I think, how back on his heels he is by the way that Biden's departure from the race tore up his own campaign's playbook. And he still hasn't found a way to respond to the Harris phenomenon. And so then when he goes into these weird comparisons of who is better looking and he's much more attractive, on its face, that's Trump, the sort of shallow, physically obsessed person who always, I think assesses people on their physicality first and foremost. But it also is speaking, I think, more broadly to Donald Trump, the cultivator of celebrity. He doesn't study many things. He's a very unsophisticated man, but he is very tuned into the power and persuasive magnetism of celebrity. And I think he clearly recognizes that she brings an ocean of charisma and vitality to this campaign that Joe Biden wasn't. And I think he's unnerved by that. But that's my take. What do you think?
No, I mean, the fascinating thing about Trump, right, is he's a very he's a dishonest person. There's not a lot of accuracy in the statements, but he's also a very he's almost a transparent person. You can tell what's on his mind, right, when he comes up and he's speaking, and he's really upset by the unfairness of having his opponent switched out on him and needing to face off against somebody who's more formidable. That bothers him. I don't think anyone is sitting in a message testing lab and saying, like, Mr. President, like, this is what you should talk about on the rally.
And he wouldn't listen anyway. So
right. And, but, and it's like, people know, right? I mean, we all know, his best issues, right, against Harris are to talk about grocery prices, to talk about immigration, to talk about crime. And he does it some of the time, but there's just this other stuff that's on his mind. He thinks it's annoying that he had to run in a primary and schlep around and talk about Ron DeSantis. And Harris got to not do that, and he's upset. And so he's going to say that. And it's very different from how most politicians speak. It's something that some people like about him, though, right? That he's very off script. I think they find him emotionally authentic, even if it's not true what it is he's saying up there. But he's bothered, right? I mean, he's been running this whole race, for his freedom, for his personal, immunity from legal consequences for his various crimes. And he's been willing to, in some ways, be more ruthless even than he has in the past, throwing chunks of the pro-life movement under the bus, making his peace with J.D. Vance, who used to be very sharply critical of him. But he thought he was going to win, and now he thinks he might lose. It's a close election, but he's behind in the polls, and you can tell it's bothering him. He's not a happy warrior. He's not a cheerful guy up there, and he doesn't want to face a universe in which prosecutions against him go forward, and in which potentially, I mean, maybe he'll run a fourth time if he loses, but who knows, right? I mean, this command that he has over Republican Party politics seems like it can't last forever, particularly if he faces a second defeat.
And there's no obvious sort of inheritor of the mantle of Trumpism, because it's so much tied to the sort of cult of his own personality. I was in Milwaukee for the RNC recently, and the amount of confidence that was at that event, the map had shifted. Republican operatives there were talking to me about, Colorado's in play, and maybe Minnesota's in play. And Trump sort of sat at that convention like an emperor. Ron DeSantis came out and kissed the ring. Nikki Haley came out and kissed the ring. And then in very short order, that entire world's been turned upside down. And now Democrats are talking about, well, possibly North Carolina's back in play. And there's been what I kind of consider a pipe dream that, maybe even Florida. I don't see Florida happening. But Governor Roy Cooper was at a meeting with several of us yesterday here in Chicago. And he was talking, he said that North Carolina feels to him like Obama in 2008. Like he's seeing that same kind of groundswell. And when I asked him to be specific about it, what quarters is that energy coming from? He immediately just identified younger voters. And that's come up in other conversations I've had with political strategists here and in Milwaukee, but really here. And the idea that both younger voters and then also Latino voters, that the polls may not be fully capturing where they land as voters because they are incented in a new way. This may be the first election that some of them are heard from, et cetera, which is also interesting. And I think when we look at the swing state map, obviously with Latino voters, Arizona, Nevada, that's going to be a powerful force there. But I was wondering, if you have any thoughts on the swing state dynamics. I know there's, say, 7 of them right now. None of them are the same. It's not a cookie cutter analysis, but we both know that's where this race is going to be won or lost. And the issues in those states matter.
It does, and it's interesting, right? I mean, we sort of talk about a Rust Belt set of swing states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and then people use Sun Belt to describe Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, and North Carolina. I'm pedantic. North Carolina is actually not particularly sunny. But, I think the difference is that these are the northern states are very slow going. These are places that have had a rough economic time, not like on a 1-year, 2-year horizon, but on a generational horizon.
The great post-industrial unwinding.
Yeah. And the southern swing states is the opposite, right? Phoenix, Atlanta, Las Vegas, these are cities that have gone from being sort of backwaters to thriving metropolises that have pro sports teams that they didn't used to have, that have cultural amenities, that have rapid kind of growth. And so it means, attitudinally, like what do you want to convey to people in these places is different. And it's a kind of a balance, right? In which a kind of a more optimistic, more forward-thinking message seems like a better fit for the more southerly states, right? We're not going back, right? Is an idea that it references abortion, it references the troubles of Trump's prior presidency, but it also references a general idea of a forward march of progress in the United States that you want to align with. When you're talking to people in Michigan, they don't want to go back to a time when women didn't have equal rights, things like that. But there is much more nostalgia in the political culture of those northern Midwestern states, of a sense that, Detroit used to be the center of the economic universe, and it isn't anymore.
Right.
And people want to bring it back. And that's, that's the challenge of messaging, right? You've got to do a little bit of both, be the candidate of the future, but also, the candidate who knows that the average age of the electorate is somewhere in their 50s. You want to mobilize young voters because they are more they're more persuadable. People who haven't voted in previous elections, it's really an open question. Will they vote in November? Who will they vote for?
What are you thinking about that in terms of sort of the pockets of unseen or unheard from voters that may not be captured by the polls? Do you think that's how big a factor do you think that's going to be in the swing states?
Well, I mean, you don't know until you know, right, what kinds of polling error are out there. Democrats have done better with the kind of most reliable voters in the Biden era. They've done very well in special elections. They did really well in this Alaska primary that happened last night. Biden has not done as well with people who are a little disconnected from the system. And that's been a big kind of concern, hanging over the cloud. The hope is that Harris, will connect, especially with younger women, with Black and Latino women who are not necessarily super political, or all that deeply invested in voting, but can see something appealing and exciting, something they want to be part of. That was a lot of the Obama phenomenon in 2008. I saw in my neighborhood in DC, working class Black moms standing on long lines to bring their kids to vote in what wasn't even remotely a swing state. It was just people wanted to be part of the history making process, and she's not going to talk about that explicitly in her speeches, but it's the subtext of so much of what's going on in the nominations, in Hillary's presence on Monday night, that this would be an epical event for American women and for, fathers of daughters and many other kinds of people out there who, Trump is so much on the opposite end of that spectrum, not just in terms of abortion rights, but some of his legal troubles, things he's said about women over the years, right? And it's a real question of, are we going to have a society of equals, a society of opportunity, or a really kind of retrograde Trump Vance vision that like Trump and Vance are so different a little bit in their, traditionalism and family politics, but at the intersection of the two of them is something that, I think all the women in my life find very alarming and disturbing, and that Harris counters in a way that's optimistic and, makes people excited, not just fearful of the opposition.
One of the sort of overnight wild cards that's in, I think, a swing state factor too is the possibility that RFK Jr. might now be dropping out of the race, and he's sort of rattling his saber that he's going to, talk to his voters about backing Trump.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if he's amassed enough of a footprint for that to matter at all. I sort of think of him as a drop in the bucket, but am I being too cavalier in brushing off his electoral influence?
Well, it seemed like a big part of where Harris made gains when Democrats swapped the nominees is that there was a substantial swing from Kennedy to her, right? As just kind of younger, I say more disconnected people sort of gravitated back to the Democratic ticket. So there's a theory that I think is plausible that the remaining RFK vote is sort of likely to go to Trump if he diminishes. That being said, third party voters are very weird. The third party vote always fades down the stretch. That's been the experience of sort of every kind of poll that's been out there. There are always real questions as to whether people who say they're going to vote third party will in fact vote at all. Because these are not campaign organizations. They don't have field offices. They don't have kind of deep ties to people. Kennedy is also a kook. Adding him to the Trump stable, along with, he's endorsed by a bunch of Democratic Party politicians who've been sent to prison for various crimes, Kwame Kilpatrick and Ron Blagojevich, people like that. This is a really off kilter, weird, I guess, is
lawless
the
and
line that
lawless.
people are doing. But yeah, RFK Jr. is an odd individual, pushing very strange conspiracy theories, disavowing in terms of vaccine development. What I think sane people think of as the high point of Trump's administration. So I don't know. I mean, I would not. I'll put it this way. I don't think the Harris campaign is aggressively seeking RFK Jr.'s endorsement. It's not obvious this is a guy who brings a net
Anything to the table for them.
to a movement.
Yeah. So what's on your sort of what are some of the ahas on your mind looking forward and looking ahead as we, Harris obviously has her speech Thursday night. The home team has already built up a lot of momentum. I think the issue now is what's she going to use that for tactically in the short months ahead before November 5th.
Yeah, I mean, this has been a very brief election by American standards. We had
it's sort of refreshing in that regard, isn't it? Like to have a compressed electoral calendar. I find it focuses the mind and it narrows the window.
It's really nice. And so I think what we will be waiting to see with the convention wrapped up is what kind of press engagement and rollout does Harris do? Because the week before the convention, this had been sort of growing buzz. Like when she's sitting for interviews, when's she going to be on the the Bloomberg live stream with you, and it's like, wait, she's got to select a vice presidential nominee. They're going to do some rallies together. They got to plan out this whole convention. So that's going to happen. But then, it seems like a little bit of a dead time will arrive. And, we've seen Harris completely electrify Democrats and stage these huge mega rallies, but we haven't seen that much of her in sort of informal settings where she has to, parry with people, whether that's a town hall setting, an interview setting, a press conference setting,
or the upcoming debate with Trump in a few weeks.
Yeah. I mean, there will be debates, and that's always a question, that's kind of out there, right? Politics has this kind of big performance, but also small performance elements. And where the message on the economy, as we were talking about earlier, is I think like immigration is a weak spot for Democrats, but Democrats are 100% sure what they want to say about it at this point. They talk about this bill that Trump scuttled. They talk about how border crossings are down, and it's like they're locked and loaded.
They've closed the asylum loop.
Exactly. And, people may not be persuaded by that message, but I could tell you on the economy, I mean, I pay a lot of attention. Different Democrats said different things in the convention speeches about the economy. Different people close to Kamala Harris said different things about her own economy speech. They said things to me. People said things to me. People said different things to different reporters. There's just not consensus in the Democratic Party as to exactly how they want to talk about inflation and the cost of living. And, only the candidate can ultimately decide these kind of things. This is the direction I want to go, even though economic policy has not been at the center of her identity and her personality, but it's always an important issue. She's going to have to make some choices, get everybody on board, and see where you can go with it.
I mean, on the economic side, right? Last night you had Bernie Sanders, perhaps one of them, along with AOC, the most vibrant sort of populist voices in the party. And then you had J.B. Pritzker, who was reminding people he was an authentic billionaire, and Trump isn't, right? And then Ken Chenault, the former CEO of American Express. And that's one of the things that's challenging, I think, within the big tent of the Democratic Party for anyone who aspires to be a voice. For all of it, it has many, many complicated houses inside.
Yeah, that Bernie to Chenault, dichotomy is a tough one to bridge. Do you want to say what I think is true in a case I've made in Bloomberg columns that ultimately the Biden administration has done well for business, that the stock market has done well, that Trump is very destabilizing, will strike at the foundations of American prosperity, and that Harris should welcome that kind of support and try to get more Ken Chenaults out there and, Bob Rubin's and other people like that, versus a kind of Bernie ethic that, not just we should have a more expansive welfare state, but that like billionaires as a class shouldn't exist, is a sentiment that's out there on the left, and that I think resonates with many people, but also alienates another large group of people and seems dangerous in its own way. Barack Obama.
There's two edges to that sword, right? When you invoke billionaire, there's the idea of billionaire oligarch who's predatory, but that comes at the expense of, say, billionaire founder or entrepreneur, right?
Exactly.
And so it runs Elon Musk inhabits both sides of that. He's someone who's gone from being a kind of entrepreneurial, mythic entrepreneurial figure to now being an abusive and unhinged predatory figure. And I think the Dems have to figure out how to put a bow around some of those ideas so they're discernible and palatable to a broader electorate.
Absolutely. Because I think, I think that this connects with Harris's instincts when she talks in a very general way. She talks about aspiration. She talks about how people want to get ahead and not just get by. Obviously, I think most people are aware that they are not going to found a multi-billion-dollar company personally. But, we'd all like to think that
yes,
might, or at least most of us will. And, and I think most people admire in general the idea of successful entrepreneurs and business people, even if they don't agree with them about everything. But there is a school of thought, I mean, Vermont is a very interesting state, right? Like there aren't any big companies headquartered there, right? It's like a whole economy of like bed and breakfasts and small dairy farms. But that's not what most people's lives are like. People would like to get a better paycheck at work. They'd like a better commute, things like that. But in polls, like most people like their jobs. Most people like their supervisors. They like their coworkers. They admire.
They want to know that they're having a steady paycheck coming in.
Yeah,
and that they trust the person paying it.
And they want a prosperous economy, which they understand involves like businesses that succeed and grow. And it's Barack Obama has always been, I think, the best of contemporary Democrats at striking that balance, at saying things that moderates find reassuring without
alienating,
like punching left and angering more left-wing people. And that's the art of politics. There's two parties and 330 million Americans. You're never going to articulate something that like everybody agrees with, but you have to make everybody feel like they're heard and that they're included in your coalition. Democrats have done a solid job of that so far this week, but it's challenging. It's the more diverse party, which means it's always a higher degree of difficulty to boil it down to one candidate and one message rather than this kind of procession of speakers who unfolds across a multi-night arc.
Well, and I think that's the challenge, and we're going to see for Kamala Harris. I think we're going to see her, shape her message in real time as she wrestles with that in the weeks ahead. I hope you'll come back again.
Absolutely.
And spend a little time to talk about this stuff. Matt Iglesias, political economist, economic observer, good human being. Thank you for joining the Bloomberg Opinion Politics live stream this morning. I'm Tim O'Brien, the senior executive editor of Bloomberg Opinion, and we will be back next week. Actually, I'm going to amend that. We'll actually be here Friday for a post-Kamala Harris chat. Forgot about that. We're doing so many this week. All right. Thank you all. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you.